Most people know what needs to be done, but keep putting it off until tomorrow. The truth is, nothing changes until you do. If you want real progress, you have to force yourself to get it done even when you don't feel like it. That's the only way anything important ever happens. Waiting for the right mood or the perfect moment just leads to more excuses and more regret. When you choose to force yourself to take action, you take control of your results and your future. You stop letting your mind talk you out of your goals. Every day you wait is a day you lose. If you're tired of feeling stuck, this is your moment to push past hesitation, take charge, and prove to yourself that you can get it done no matter what. The phantom that governs a million lives. There exists in every human mind a peculiar resistance, a force as real as gravity, as pervasive as the air we breathe, that stands between a man's present circumstances and his desired achievement. I have observed this force in the lives of paupers and millionaires alike. It operates with equal power in the coal mines of West Virginia and the executive offices of Wall Street. This resistance is not mere laziness, though the untrained mind mistakes it for such. After 20 years of studying America's most successful men, Carnegie, Ford, Edison, Harriman, and hundreds of others, I discovered a singular trait that separated those who achieved great wealth from those who merely talked of achievement. This trait was not superior intelligence, nor exceptional talent, nor favorable circumstances. It was something far more fundamental, the capacity for self-compulsion. By self-compulsion, I do not mean brute force or harsh self-criticism. I speak of the ability to direct one's mental and physical energies toward a definite end, regardless of inner resistance, external obstacles, or emotional fluctuation. The great captains of industry did not wait for inspiration. They possessed a secret method of commanding themselves into motion. Here is the central paradox. The very act of forcing yourself to begin creates the conditions that make continuation natural. The initial compulsion dissolves into momentum. What starts as deliberate self-discipline transforms into effortless flow. This is not theory. This is the observed reality of every substantial achievement in human history. I once sat across from a Pennsylvania steel mill owner who had built considerable fortune from nothing. When I asked whether he always felt ready to take bold action, his answer startled me. "Hill," he said, "most mornings I would rather have stayed in bed." When opportunities for expansion presented themselves, fear nearly paralyzed me. But I learned something. Feeling reluctant and taking action are not opposites. They can occur simultaneously. Consider the pattern governing lives of drifters, those with no definite chief aim who live at the mercy of circumstance. Each morning arrives bearing obligations and opportunities. The drifter surveys these demands and calculates, do I feel like doing this? Finding inevitable resistance, for resistance is always present, he postpones. Tomorrow, he tells himself, conditions will be better. But tomorrow arrives bearing the same resistance, now compounded by yesterday's neglect. The debt unpaid gains interest. The letter unwritten requires more explanation. The opportunity not seized passes to another. The drifter's life becomes a mounting pile of postponements, each requiring more energy than it would have initially. This pattern corrodes the will itself. Each time a man yields to postponement, he weakens the mental muscle of self-governance. His capacity for self-direction atrophies. He becomes increasingly dependent on external pressure to force him into action. He transforms himself into a reactive being rather than a creative force. The stakes could not be higher. Every unfulfilled ambition, every abandoned dream, every life of quiet mediocrity traces back to this single failure, the inability to command oneself into action despite the mind's natural resistance. But I bring you good news. This capacity can be developed. The method can be learned. In the chapters that follow, I shall show you precisely how successful men overcome this universal force. and how you can do the same starting tomorrow morning. The readiness that never arrives. The average person labors under a destructive delusion. He believes that successful men accomplish great things because they feel motivated, inspired, and ready to act. He imagines Andrew Carnegie awoke each morning burning with eagerness to build his steel empire, that Edison felt constant enthusiasm for experiments. This belief, perhaps more than any other single factor, sentences millions to lives of unfulfilled potential. I've sat across the desk from men of great achievement and asked directly, "Did you always feel ready to take action?" Without exception, they told me the same truth. More often than not, they proceeded despite reluctance, fatigue, doubt, and pressing temptation to delay. The millionaire banker confided that most mornings he would rather have stayed in bed. The factory owner admitted that fear nearly paralyzed him before every major expansion. What distinguished these men was not the absence of resistance, but their systematic method of overcoming it. They had discovered that waiting for readiness was tantamount to waiting for failure. They learned that action creates readiness, not the other way around. When Henry Ford set out to develop the V8 engine, his engineers insisted it was impossible. For weeks, Ford contemplated the challenges. Each contemplation magnified the obstacles until they seemed insurmountable. Then one morning, he commanded his engineers to begin construction immediately. He told me later, "The first step feels like pushing a factory machine idle all winter, tremendous resistance, grinding metal, everything fighting you. But once that flywheel begins turning, it develops momentum. Soon, the machine drives itself." This describes what I call the law of mental momentum. Just as a body in motion tends to remain in motion, as any man who has pushed a stalled automobile understands, so does a mind committed to action tend to continue. The initial resistance that feels overwhelming exists almost entirely at the starting point. Once movement begins, resistance diminishes dramatically. I have witnessed this pattern hundreds of times. A man agonizes over a task for days, finally forces himself to begin, and within 15 minutes the resistance has largely evaporated. The task he dreaded reveals itself as manageable. This is not coincidence but law. Consider the fatal pattern governing millions. The man wakes. He surveys obligations. He asks, "Do I feel like addressing these tasks?" Finding resistance, he postpones. "Tomorrow I'll feel more ready." But tomorrow arrives bearing the same resistance, now compounded by yesterday's neglect and the guilt of broken promises. This creates a downward spiral where delay begets more difficult delay. Most men spend more mental energy avoiding work than the work itself would require. The procrastinator believes he is conserving limited energy by postponing difficult tasks. In truth, he depletes energy through constant maintenance of resistance. Here is what you must understand. The moment you take the first action toward a postponed task, you break the spell of inaction. That first step, however small, creates momentum. The second step comes more easily than the first. The third, easier still. You are not waiting for motivation to produce action. You are using action to produce motivation. This is the great secret that practical men of achievement employ daily. They recognize that the mind's resistance is most powerful in contemplation and weakest in execution. Therefore, they move swiftly from thought to action, giving resistance no opportunity to fortify itself. Tomorrow morning, you will face your first test. Do not wait to feel ready. Command yourself to begin. What successful men actually possessed? Having destroyed the myth that successful men felt ready or motivated, I must now reveal what they actually possessed. It was not superior willpower, as you might assume, nor was it exceptional courage or iron determination. It was the capacity for self-compulsion. By self-compulsion, I do not mean brute force or harsh self-criticism, I speak of something infinitely more powerful, the ability to direct one's mental and physical energies toward a definite end, regardless of inner resistance, external obstacles, or emotional fluctuation. During my research, I encountered a Philadelphia attorney who had built substantial practice despite what he called his natural indolence. When I inquired about his method, he explained something illuminating. Each morning, he wrote instructions to himself as though commanding a subordinate. At 9 a.m., Mr. Thompson will review the Anderson brief and prepare 3 counter-arguments. This simple technique of third-person instruction created psychological distance from his reluctance. He obeyed these written commands with the same reliability he would show toward a senior partner's directive. Within 5 years, this practice transformed him from struggling attorney into one of Philadelphia's most successful practitioners. What Thompson discovered, and what all successful men discover, is that you are not a single, unified being. You contain 2 selves, a higher directing intelligence and a lower impulsive nature. The lower self feels resistance, seeks comfort, suggests postponement. The higher self observes these impulses and makes decisions based on purpose rather than feeling. Andrew Carnegie developed the capacity to feel reluctance and simultaneously decide that reluctance was irrelevant to his course of action. This is not suppression of emotion, but transcendence through recognition. Let me make a crucial distinction. Self-compulsion is not an act of violence against oneself. It is an act of self-mastery rooted in profound understanding. You are not your fleeting emotions. You are not your momentary reluctance. You are the directing intelligence that can observe these fluctuations and choose to act despite them. When you command yourself into motion, you are not forcing an unwilling victim. You are asserting your true nature as a being capable of self-governance. The men I have studied who achieved lasting success developed what might be called a higher self that supervised the impulses of the lower self. Think of it as a wise father directing a son. The father does not despise the child's desire to play rather than study. He simply recognizes that immediate desires, if allowed to govern completely, would prevent the child's long-term flourishing. So the father directs with firm compassion. Here is the secret within the secret. You do not need to possess extraordinary self-compulsion before you begin. The first small act of commanding yourself into motion creates the capacity for self-compulsion. Like a muscle, this capacity grows through use. The man who forces himself to write one sentence discovers he has created momentum to write a paragraph. The paragraph creates momentum for a page. You are not exercising willpower you already possess. You are building willpower through action. Beginning tonight, establish your internal command structure. Write tomorrow's 3 most important actions in third-person form. Read these commands aloud before sleeping. When morning arrives, execute them without internal negotiation. A soldier does not debate orders from his commanding officer. Neither will you debate commands issued by your higher self to your lower self. Action creates willpower. I must now reveal the most counterintuitive principle in this entire work, a truth that contradicts everything propagated by those who have never built anything of substance. The popular belief holds that strong willpower creates successful action. I tell you now that this is precisely backward. Successful action creates willpower. When I interviewed Henry Ford about his legendary persistence in developing the V8 engine despite his engineers declaring it impossible, he revealed something profound. He did not begin with iron determination fully formed. He began with a decision, a definite decision to proceed regardless of feeling. That first action of commanding his engineers to continue their work, despite their protests and his own doubts, created a small reserve of resolve. The second action drew upon and slightly expanded that reserve. The third action expanded it further. Ford told me, "You don't build willpower and then act. You act, and that builds willpower. This insight contradicts everything the procrastinator believes. He waits to feel powerful before he acts. But power comes from action, not before it. This is the great secret of self-compulsion. You do not need to wait until you possess extraordinary willpower. You need only command yourself into the first action, however small. That single act of self-governance begins to accumulate force. I observed this principle operating in my own life during preparation of this philosophy. There were mornings when the prospect of writing another chapter felt insurmountable. My mind generated 1,000 reasons to delay: fatigue, lack of inspiration, other pressing matters. But I had learned Carnegie's secret. I did not argue with the resistance. I did not wait for it to dissolve. I simply sat at my typewriter and wrote the first sentence. That sentence, however imperfect, broke the spell of inaction. The second sentence came more easily. Within 15 minutes, the resistance had vanished entirely. This is the technique that practical men of achievement employ daily. They recognize that the mind's resistance is most powerful in contemplation and weakest in execution. Therefore, they move swiftly from thought to action, giving resistance no opportunity to fortify itself. But there is a deeper element that must be grasped. Self-compulsion is not an act of violence against oneself. It is an act of self-mastery rooted in profound understanding. You are not your fleeting emotions. You are the directing intelligence that can observe these fluctuations and choose to act despite them. The men I studied who achieved lasting success developed what might be called a higher self that supervised the impulses of the lower self. Carnegie could feel reluctance and simultaneously decide that reluctance was irrelevant to his course of action. Edison experienced discouragement and yet continued his experiments because he understood that feelings are temporary weather patterns, while purpose is the permanent ground beneath them. Beginning tomorrow, identify the task you have been avoiding because you believe you lack sufficient willpower for it. Instead of waiting another day to build willpower, use the task itself as the willpower building exercise. Your only objective is to take the absolute smallest possible first action toward this task. The man who forces himself to write one sentence discovers he has created momentum to write a paragraph. You are not exercising willpower you already possess. You are building willpower through action. Each time you force yourself to act despite resistance, you make a deposit in your willpower account. These deposits accumulate with compound interest. You are not waiting to feel powerful. You are building power through action. The morning victory that determines your day. The moment you awaken is the most critical juncture of your day. In these first hours, your definite decision either strengthens or weakens. I call this the morning victory, the practice of acting on your commitment within 1 hour of waking, before resistance can fortify itself through contemplation. When you win the morning, momentum carries through the day. When you postpone your commitment to later, resistance compounds throughout the day, making action progressively more difficult. Edison arrived at his laboratory at the same hour each morning, regardless of how he felt. Carnegie reviewed his daily objectives before correspondence. These men understood that routine eliminates the necessity of decision. When an action becomes automatic through morning repetition, resistance finds no foothold. I counseled a New York insurance salesman named Morrison who struggled with making difficult calls to potential clients. He attended my workshop and committed to calling 3 challenging prospects each morning at 9 a.m. sharp. The first week was difficult. His mind generated elaborate excuses to delay, but he held firm to the morning timing. By week 3, something remarkable occurred. He no longer experienced the urge to postpone. At 8:55 a.m., he automatically began reviewing his prospect list. By 9 a.m., he was dialing. The action had become routine. Within 6 months, his commissions tripled. The transformation was not in his sales technique, but in the sacred routine that ensured he practiced it daily. Here is what you must understand. Whatever your definite decision commits you to, begin it within 1 hour of waking. This timing is critical. Later in the day, obligations multiply, energy depletes, and resistance strengthens. The morning hour, protected, becomes sacred ground where transformation occurs. Before sleep tonight, prepare everything needed for morning success. If writing, have materials ready. If exercise, have clothing laid out. If study, have books open to the correct page. This preparation eliminates the micro decisions that become postponement excuses. When the committed hour arrives tomorrow, do not consult your feelings. Do not assess whether conditions are favorable. Do not engage in internal debate. Simply begin. The moment you allow negotiation, resistance gains power. The moment you act without negotiation, resistance loses power. Research I conducted shows that a practice performed consistently for 30 days becomes significantly easier. The neural pathways establish themselves. The mental resistance weakens. Commit to 30 consecutive mornings without exception. This creates the foundation for permanent change. Mark each successful morning on a calendar. The accumulating streak becomes valuable. You do not want to break it. This simple visual representation creates additional motivation to maintain consistency. Tomorrow morning, implement this sequence. Upon waking, before checking messages or attending to other matters, read your definite decision aloud. Within 60 minutes, begin the committed action. If your decision is to write, write one sentence. If to exercise, begin the first movement. If to study, open the book and read one paragraph. After completing your morning practice, mark the calendar with a visible mark, an X, a check mark, a gold star. This ritual should become as automatic as brushing teeth. Your morning practice is not merely one task among many. It is the foundation that determines whether the entire structure stands or collapses. Win the morning, and you win the day. Win 30 consecutive mornings, and you transform your life. When resistance becomes your signal for important work. After consistent morning victories, your relationship with resistance transforms entirely. What once felt like an obstacle becomes valuable information. I call this stage momentum consciousness, the recognition that resistance is not an enemy but a signal indicating you are approaching significant work. This is counterintuitive. You learn to interpret the presence of resistance as confirmation that you are on the right track. Meaningful work generates resistance precisely because it requires growth beyond your current capacity. When a salesman feels reluctance before a challenging call, this feeling indicates the call is important. When a writer feels resistance before beginning, this feeling indicates the writing is significant. I counseled a Philadelphia architect named Douglas, who had been postponing his own building designs while completing commissions for others. He complained that whenever he sat down to work on his personal projects, overwhelming resistance appeared. After 3 months of morning practice, he reported something remarkable. Hill, now when I feel that familiar resistance as I approach my drawing table, I think, good, this must be important work. The feeling hasn't disappeared, but my interpretation has reversed. What once warned me away now confirms I'm moving in the right direction. Within 18 months, Douglas opened his own prestigious firm designing public buildings. When you feel resistance arising, instead of thinking, this is too hard, I should postpone. Train yourself to think, this resistance indicates important work that requires my best effort. This reframe transforms resistance from obstacle into compass, pointing toward growth. Easy tasks generate minimal resistance. Difficult tasks that expand your capacity generate maximum resistance. Therefore, the presence of resistance often indicates you are attempting something that will develop new abilities. This is good, not bad. Keep a record of times you acted despite resistance and achieved positive results. Review this record when resistance appears. The evidence demonstrates that resistance is a poor predictor of outcome. You have succeeded many times despite feeling resistant. Momentum consciousness creates a powerful positive cycle. Action generates results, results generate confidence. Confidence makes future action easier. Each completed task strengthens your capacity for the next. This creates an upward spiral. Within months of consistent practice, tasks that once seemed impossible become routine. Track your subjective experience of resistance intensity over weeks. You will notice that the same tasks generate progressively less resistance as you repeatedly face them. This demonstrates that resistance is not fixed but responsive to your behavior. When resistance appears before a task, implement this three-step response. First, recognize it. I notice resistance arising. Second, reinterpret it. This resistance indicates important work. Third, act immediately, using the 5-minute threshold to begin without further contemplation. This sequence should become automatic within weeks. Each evening, note one task where you felt resistance but acted anyway, and what resulted. After 30 entries, review them. You will see overwhelming evidence that resistance is a phantom powerful in anticipation, powerless in execution. You no longer fear resistance. When it appears, you recognize it as familiar territory rather than threatening force. You have accumulated dozens or hundreds of experiences where you felt resistant, acted anyway, and achieved positive results. This evidence creates a new default response. Resistance triggers action rather than postponement. You begin to trust yourself in a way you never have before, not because you always feel confident, but because you have proven repeatedly that you act regardless of feeling. The sacred routine that makes discipline automatic. There is a stage where self-compulsion becomes so integrated into your daily structure that it no longer requires active willpower. I call this the sacred routine stage. The word sacred is deliberate. The successful man treats his productive routines with the same inviolability that the devout treat religious observance. Edison arrived at his laboratory at the same hour each morning, regardless of circumstances. Carnegie reviewed his objectives before correspondence. These men understood that routine eliminates the necessity of decision. When an action becomes automatic through repetition, resistance finds no foothold. Discipline is most difficult when you must decide anew each day. Discipline becomes effortless when it is simply what you do at a particular time, in a particular sequence, without exception. The routine carries you. A Detroit mechanic named Sullivan attended my workshop in 1935, struggling with inconsistent work on his invention, a new type of engine valve. Some days he worked zealously for hours. Other days, resistance kept him from his workshop entirely. I advised him to establish a sacred routine. Every evening, 7 to 8:30 p.m., in his workshop without exception. No decisions about whether he felt creative. No negotiations about alternative timing. Just the routine. Within weeks, he reported that by 6:55 p.m., his mind automatically began engaging with the problems he was solving. By 7 p.m., he was at his bench. The routine had become autonomous. He secured a patent in 1937 and sold the design to a major manufacturer. Establish your practice with 3 identical elements every occurrence. Identical time of day, identical physical location, identical opening sequence. This consistency creates neural pathways that trigger automatically. While 30 days creates a habit, 90 days solidifies it to the point where violation feels more difficult than maintenance. After 90 consecutive days, the routine becomes part of your identity. This is what I do. Create a simple, specific action that signals the beginning of your practice. For a writer, it might be brewing coffee and sitting in a specific chair. For an athlete, it might be donning particular clothing. This trigger cues your mind that the practice is beginning. Protect your sacred routine time as fiercely as you would a critical business meeting. Allow no intrusions except genuine emergencies. When others learn your routine is inviolable, they stop requesting exceptions. On days when circumstances make the full practice impossible, execute a minimum version. If you cannot write for the full hour, write for 10 minutes. This maintains the streak and prevents the erosion that comes from complete omission. Define your sacred routine with precision. Exact start time, not morning, but 6 a.m. Exact location, not at home, but at the desk in the study. Exact opening. Sequence, not start writing, but open laptop, review yesterday's work, write one sentence. Write this specification. For 90 days, execute it without exception. If travel or unusual circumstances make the usual location impossible, maintain the time and opening sequence in whatever location you find yourself. The consistency is more important than perfection. After 90 days, the routine becomes self-sustaining. You become someone for whom discipline is not a struggle but a structure. The daily practice that once required willpower now happens automatically. You do not wake up and decide whether to execute your commitment. The commitment executes itself at the appointed time. This creates remarkable freedom. The mental energy previously spent on internal negotiation is now available for the work itself. Mastery, when self-compulsion becomes self-direction. There is a final stage beyond even sacred routine. I call it mastery, the point at which self-compulsion becomes self-direction. The mature man of achievement no longer experiences internal conflict between desire and action. His actions flow naturally from his definite purpose. He has trained himself so thoroughly in immediate execution that postponement feels foreign to his nature. Carnegie told me, I don't force myself to work. Work is simply what I do. The question of whether I feel like it never arises, but understand this clearly. Mastery is not the elimination of all resistance. Even disciplined men encounter difficult mornings and challenging projects. Mastery is the ability to act despite these fluctuations without internal debate. The master recognizes resistance, acknowledges it, and proceeds regardless, all in the space of a moment. I studied a factory owner named Williamson, who had practiced morning self-compulsion for 7 years. I asked him if he still felt resistance. Occasionally, he said, but it's different now. Resistance appears for perhaps 3 seconds. I notice it the way you might notice a cloud passing. Then I act. There's no internal argument, no weighing of options, no consultation with feelings. The resistance is simply acknowledged and transcended in the same motion. He compared it to a skilled boxer who sees a punch coming and deflects it without conscious thought. Pure trained reflex. This is mastery. Resistance still appears, but the response has become automatic and immediate. At the mastery stage, the gap between recognizing resistance and taking action shrinks to near zero. You develop the capacity to notice resistance and act despite it in a single fluid motion. This is not suppression of feeling, but transcendence of its governing power. You no longer see yourself as someone working on discipline, but as someone who is disciplined. The practice has become inseparable from your sense of self. When resistance appears, it conflicts with your identity, making action the path of least resistance. After hundreds or thousands of repetitions of acting despite resistance, the response pattern becomes encoded at a deep level. You no longer consciously employ techniques. Your trained self automatically executes the correct response. Yet even masters maintain their foundational practices. The morning routine continues. The sacred structure persists. Mastery is not freedom from structure, but freedom within structure. The practices that created mastery must continue to sustain it. You cannot force yourself into mastery. It emerges organically through sustained practice of the previous 5 stages. However, you can recognize when you are approaching it by observing decreased internal debate before action, reduced time between impulse to postpone and decision to proceed, automatic execution of your sacred routine without conscious decision-making, resistance feeling less like an obstacle and more like background noise. When you notice these signs, acknowledge your progress while maintaining the practices that created it. Do not abandon the morning routine or sacred structure, believing you have graduated beyond their necessity. The greatest danger at the mastery stage is abandoning the practices that created mastery. Having achieved automaticity, some men believe they can now skip the morning routine or relax the sacred boundaries. This leads to gradual regression. You have become someone fundamentally different from who you were at Chapter 1. Resistance still appears, but you relate to it the way a sailor relates to wind, as a natural force to be worked with, not fought against. Your default response to significant tasks is immediate action rather than contemplation. You know that when you commit to something, you will execute it. The 5 techniques that master self-compulsion. Knowledge of principles is worthless without methods of application. In this chapter, I present 5 specific techniques that successful men employ to command themselves into action despite resistance. These are not theories, but proven methods I have observed in Carnegie, Edison, Ford, and hundreds of less famous but equally disciplined men. Each technique addresses a specific obstacle to action. I observed 2 foremen at a Pennsylvania steel mill, both with identical crews, wages, and responsibilities. Briggs approached each challenge by consulting his feelings. Do I have the energy for this? Finding doubt, he postponed or referred problems upward. Daniels employed specific techniques. When resistance appeared, he committed to work on the problem for only 5 minutes. When morning came, he spoke declarations before his feet touched the floor. For critical tasks, he wrote commands to himself as though commanding another person. Within 3 years, Daniels was superintendent. Within 7, he owned his own fabrication plant. Briggs remained a foreman for 17 years. The difference was not talent, but technique. Technique 1, the 5-minute rule. When facing a task that generates resistance, command yourself to work on it for only 5 minutes. This small commitment bypasses the mind's tendency to project difficulty across hours. Once 5 minutes pass, continuation is usually easier than stopping. The purpose is not to do only 5 minutes of work, but to bypass the initial resistance. Technique 2, the morning declaration. Before your feet touch the floor each morning, speak aloud your commitment to the day's priorities. Today I will complete X, Y, and Z without consulting my feelings. This verbal activation engages conscious direction before unconscious resistance patterns establish themselves. Say it with conviction, not mechanically. Technique 3, the written command. For important tasks generating significant resistance, write explicit instructions to yourself as though commanding another person. At 8 a.m., John will review the quarterly reports and identify 3 critical improvements. Not, I should look at those reports. The third-person instruction creates distance from emotional resistance. Keep commands simple and direct. Technique 4, the resistance journal. Each evening, record moments when resistance arose and how you responded. This serves multiple purposes: consciousness of patterns, creation of a victory record that builds confidence, transformation of resistance from enemy into valuable data about your growth. Brief, factual entries are more valuable than lengthy self-examination. Technique 5, the physical trigger. Establish a simple physical action that signals the shift from contemplation to execution. Stand up. Take 3 deep breaths. Say, now. Through repetition, this trigger becomes a circuit breaker for the trance of hesitation. Use it consistently when you find yourself paralyzed by overthinking. Begin employing these techniques immediately, but do not attempt all 5 simultaneously. Week 1. Practice the 5-minute rule whenever resistance appears. Week 2. Add the morning declaration. Week 3. Begin writing third-person commands. Week 4. Start the evening resistance journal. Week 5. Establish your physical trigger. By the end of 5 weeks, all 5 techniques will be integrated into your daily practice. You will have a complete toolkit for commanding yourself into action regardless of resistance. You now possess specific tools instead of vague intentions. When resistance appears, you no longer feel helpless. You have 5 distinct techniques to deploy. This creates confidence. You are not trying to overcome resistance through willpower, but applying the 5-minute rule to this specific task. The specificity of technique makes self-compulsion accessible rather than mysterious. The 7 ways men abandon their commitment. I have observed thousands of men begin the journey of self-compulsion with genuine intention. Most abandon it within weeks. Not because the techniques fail, but because they fall into predictable patterns of self-sabotage. These patterns are subtle. They do not announce themselves as abandonment, but disguise themselves as reasonable adjustments or temporary exceptions. Understanding these 7 patterns of failure allows you to recognize them in yourself before they destroy your progress. A Cleveland accountant named Harrison committed to 30 minutes of morning study to qualify for partnership. For 3 weeks, he honored this commitment without exception. Then a client crisis required early morning attention. He skipped one day, intending to resume tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived with different demands. Within 2 weeks, the practice had vanished entirely. When I spoke with him 6 months later, he was still planning to restart his study routine. He had fallen into what I call the just this once erosion, the most common pattern of failure. One exception, justified by reasonable circumstances, had become permanent abandonment. Pattern 1. The just this once erosion, a single exception to your sacred routine, creates a mental pathway for future exceptions. I have good reason this time becomes, I had good reason last time too. Defense, no exceptions. If genuine emergency forces deviation, immediately return to the routine the next day with heightened commitment. Pattern 2, the preparation postponement. Before I really commit, I need to read 1 more book, attend 1 more workshop, create 1 more plan. Preparation becomes eternal postponement. Defense. Recognize that you will never feel fully prepared. Begin with the knowledge you currently possess. Pattern 3, the complexity trap. Your initial simple commitment gets elaborated into an increasingly complex system that becomes burdensome to maintain. Defense, keep it simple. 1 clear action, same time, same place. Resist the urge to create elaborate supporting structures. Pattern 4, the success complacency. Early success creates the illusion that the discipline is working and therefore can be relaxed. I've proven I can do this, so I can ease up now. Defense, recognize that the discipline is not a temporary cure but a permanent practice. Pattern 5, the perfectionism paralysis. Missing 1 day creates shame that prevents resuming. I broke the streak, so what's the point of continuing? Defense, perfect consistency is ideal, but resumption after failure is acceptable. Miss a day, return immediately without self-flagellation. Pattern 6, the comparison discouragement. Observing others' seemingly superior progress generates discouragement that undermines your own practice. Defense, your journey is your journey. Compare only to your past self, not to others. Pattern 7, the circumstance blame. Circumstances have changed, so my commitment is no longer feasible. Changed circumstances are constant. Defense, Adapt the practice to new circumstances rather than abandoning it. Read these 7 patterns carefully. Which ones have caused you to abandon past commitments? Write this recognition. For each pattern that applies to you, write the specific early warning signs you will watch for. For example, if you are susceptible to pattern 1, your warning sign might be the thought, I have good reason to skip just this once. When this thought appears, you will recognize it as pattern 1, activation, and refuse the exception. Review past attempts to develop discipline, exercise routines, business practices, educational pursuits. For each failure, identify which of the 7 patterns caused abandonment. Many people discover they repeatedly fall into the same 1 or 2 patterns. This recognition is invaluable. You now know your specific vulnerability. You now possess X-ray vision for self-sabotage. When the thought just this once appears, you recognize it immediately. When you feel the urge to create an elaborate system, you see pattern 3 emerging. This recognition creates power. You can laugh at them. Oh, there's my old friend pattern 1 again, trying to convince me I have good reason to skip today. This conscious recognition, coupled with immediate recommitment, prevents the abandonment that derails most men's transformation. Applying self-compulsion across all life domains. Once you have mastered self-compulsion in one domain, perhaps morning writing or daily exercise, the question arises, how do I extend this discipline to other areas without creating overwhelming demands? The key is sequential integration, not simultaneous pursuit. Most men fail by attempting to transform everything at once. They commit to morning exercise, evening study, better diet, improved correspondence, and creative projects all on the same day. Within a week, the complexity crushes them and they abandon everything. The master approach is different. Establish one practice until it becomes automatic, 90 days minimum, then add a second while maintaining the first. The practices compound. Within a year of sequential integration, you can have 4 or 5 disciplined practices operating simultaneously with less effort than one practice required initially. A Baltimore physician named Crawford attended my workshop, overwhelmed by competing demands. Patient care, research, family time, physical health, financial management. He wanted discipline in all areas simultaneously. I counseled him to begin with one only morning physical exercise for 90 days without adding other commitments. He resisted, wanting comprehensive transformation immediately, but he followed the advice. After 90 days, morning exercise was automatic, requiring minimal willpower. He then added evening study while maintaining exercise. 90 days later, both were automatic. He added a third practice, weekly financial review. Within 18 months, he had integrated 5 disciplined practices that operated like clockwork. His colleagues wondered how he accomplished so much. The secret was sequential integration, not superhuman willpower. Master one practice completely before adding another. Complete mastery means 90 consecutive days without exception, with the practice feeling more automatic than effortful. Choose your first practice strategically. Some practices create positive ripple effects that support future practices. Morning exercise often improves sleep, energy, and mental clarity, making subsequent practices easier. After mastering practice 1, add practice 2 while maintaining 1. After 90 days of both, add practice 3 while maintaining 1 and 2. This creates compounding discipline. Each new practice benefits from the foundation of previous ones. Never have more than one practice in the difficult, effortful stage simultaneously. If you are in the first 30 days of a new practice, do not add another until the current one reaches the automatic stage. The self-compulsion capacity you develop in one area transfers to others. The mental muscle built through morning writing makes evening study easier. The technique's 5-minute rule. Physical trigger work across all domains. If you currently maintain one discipline practice successfully, identify the next practice you wish to integrate. Do not add it yet. First, ask, has my current practice been operating automatically for 90 consecutive days? If no, continue with only the current practice. If yes, proceed to add the second practice using the same methods that established the first. Definite decision, morning execution if feasible, sacred routine structure, 90-day commitment. Track both practices on the same calendar. Create a written integration timeline. List practices you wish to establish in order of importance. Beside each, write the target start date based on sequential 90-day intervals. For example, Practice 1 starts January 1, Practice 2 starts April 1, Practice 3 starts July 1. This document creates a realistic, achievable timeline that prevents the overwhelming of simultaneous commitments. You shift from someone who can maintain one area of discipline to someone who operates with systematic self-governance across multiple life domains. Your colleagues wonder how you manage it all. The secret they don't see is that each practice required significant effort only for the first 90 days. You become living proof that discipline compounds. The power to govern your own life. When you develop the capacity to command yourself into action regardless of emotional state, you achieve something precious beyond measure. You become autonomous. This word reveals profound truth, auto-self, nomos law. You become a being governed by your own law rather than by circumstances, feelings, or external pressures. Most men live as servants to their fluctuating emotional states. They are productive when they feel energetic, creative when inspired, courageous when circumstances provide security. Their lives are at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Weather effects, mood effects, productivity affects results. But the man who masters self-compulsion steps outside this chain of cause and effect. He becomes a first cause rather than an effect. His actions originate from his definite purpose, not from his circumstances. This is the true meaning of personal power, not dominion over others, but dominion over oneself. I counseled a street Louis businessman named Thompson, who complained that external forces constantly disrupted his plans, economic conditions, supplier delays, customer demands, employee problems. Hill, he said, I cannot control these circumstances. I asked him a single question. Can you control your response to circumstances? This question transformed his understanding. For 6 months, he practiced responding to circumstances through deliberate decision rather than reactive emotion. When suppliers delayed, he calmly initiated alternative plans. When employees created problems, he addressed them systematically. Within a year, his business had doubled while his stress had halved. The circumstances had not improved, his autonomy had. You cannot control whether resistance appears, but you control whether you act despite it. You cannot control circumstances, but you control your response to circumstances. This limited but profound sphere of control is sufficient to transform any life. Reactive beings respond to forces. Creative beings initiate forces. When you act from definite purpose rather than emotional impulse, you shift from reactive to creative. You become a cause rather than an effect. Examine your daily decisions. How many originate from your deliberate purpose versus external pressure or internal emotion? Autonomy is measured by the ratio of self-directed to externally directed action. True freedom is not absence of constraint, but presence of self-governance. The man governed by impulse and circumstance is a slave despite appearing free. The man who governs himself through disciplined routine is free despite appearing constrained. Emotions are temporary: weather, rain, sun, storm, calm. Purpose is permanent ground. You cannot control the weather, but you can stand firm on the ground regardless of weather. This is autonomy, acting from purpose despite emotional weather. For 1 week, practice this awareness, exercise. Before each significant decision or action, pause and ask, is this action originating from my definite purpose or from external pressure? Simply note the answer without judgment. By week's end, you will have data showing what percentage of your life is self-governed versus externally governed. This awareness is the first step toward increasing autonomy. Each Sunday evening, review the past week and categorize your major actions. Actions originating from definite purpose, autonomous. Actions driven by external pressure, reactive. Actions driven by emotional impulse, reactive. Calculate the percentage in each category. Your goal is to increase autonomous action over time. You understand yourself differently. You are not a leaf blown by circumstance and emotion. You are a directing intelligence capable of acting from purpose regardless of external conditions or internal weather. This recognition is simultaneously humbling and empowering. Humbling because you see how much of your past was reactive. Empowering because you recognize that change requires only the exercise of this existing capacity. You do not need circumstances to improve. You need only to govern yourself more completely, keeping promises to yourself. A man cannot respect himself if he consistently fails to keep commitments to himself. When you tell yourself you will rise at 6 a.m. and then yield to temptation for another hour's sleep, you damage your self-confidence. When you promise yourself you will complete a difficult task and then postpone it, you erode your self-trust. Repeat this pattern hundreds of times and you create a deep-seated belief in your own weakness. But reverse the pattern through self-compulsion and you build genuine self-respect. Each time you command yourself into action and follow through, you prove to yourself that you are reliable. You demonstrate that your word, even to yourself, has weight. This creates an upward spiral. Self-compulsion creates kept commitments. Kept commitments create self-trust. Self-trust creates increased capacity for self-compulsion. This is not the shallow self-esteem of affirmations divorced from action. This is the earned self-respect of demonstrated reliability. A Nashville salesman named Porter struggled with crippling self-doubt despite adequate ability in consultation. I discovered he had spent years making promises to himself. He never kept a call on difficult prospects, to complete paperwork promptly, to improve his product knowledge. Each broken promise to himself reinforced the belief, I cannot trust myself. I prescribed a simple remedy. For 30 days, make only one promise to yourself daily, a promise so modest that keeping it is virtually certain. Each evening, record whether you kept it. Porter's first promise was, I will write one sentence in my prospect journal before breakfast. Trivial, but he kept it. The next day, another modest promise kept. After 30 days of perfect consistency, something remarkable occurred. His self-doubt diminished substantially, not because circumstances changed, but because he had proven himself trustworthy. Self-trust equals kept promises to self divided by total promises to self. If you keep 30% of commitments to yourself, you trust yourself 30%. If you keep 90%, you trust yourself 90%. Self-respect follows this equation precisely. Begin rebuilding self-trust through promises so small that failure is nearly impossible. One sentence written, one call made, one page read. Perfect consistency with modest commitments builds stronger foundation than sporadic success with ambitious commitments. Each time you fail to honor a commitment to yourself, you create dual damage. The task remains undone, and you reinforce the neural pathway of self-unreliability. The second cost is more serious than the first. Many men keep commitments to others scrupulously while treating commitments to themselves casually. This reveals the belief that others matter, but you do not. Reverse this. Treat commitments to yourself with the same seriousness you afford commitments to respected colleagues. Examine your current commitments to yourself. Are they realistic given your current capacity? If you are making ambitious promises and breaking them regularly, reduce the ambition radically. Better to keep a modest commitment perfectly than to fail at a grand one. For the next 30 days, make only one promise to yourself each morning. Make it achievable with near certainty. Each evening, record whether you kept it. After 30 days of perfect consistency, your self-trust will have increased measurably. Each morning, write one specific, modest commitment. Choose something achievable with 95% certainty given your schedule and energy. Each evening, write kept or broken beside that day's commitment. Your goal is 30 consecutive kept entries. Your relationship with yourself changes fundamentally. You stop being someone you cannot trust. The inner voice that says, "I'll do this tomorrow," loses credibility because you have proven repeatedly that tomorrow you will honor your commitment. This creates remarkable stability. Whereas previously your self-image fluctuated with your mood or recent success, now it rests on the solid foundation of demonstrated reliability. You know, not believe, but know that when you commit to something, you will do it. This knowledge is more valuable than any external achievement because it makes all future achievements possible. Self-determination as sacred practice. What is the purpose of human existence? Is man merely a sophisticated animal driven by pleasure and pain, or is there something higher? I submit that the capacity for self-compulsion is evidence of that higher element. No animal can force itself to act against immediate inclination in service of a distant goal. Only man possesses this power. And in exercising this power, man becomes more fully human. He participates in what might be called the divine capacity for self-determination. When you command yourself into action despite fear, doubt, and resistance, you are not merely accomplishing a task. You are exercising humanity's unique gift, the ability to transcend circumstance through will. This is not struggle against nature, but the fulfillment of nature. You were designed for self-governance. I visited a monastery in 1947 where monks rose at 4 a.m. daily for prayer and work, regardless of feeling. The abbot told me something I shall never forget. "Hill, we do not force ourselves to rise. We honor the commitment we made because humans are the only creatures capable of making and keeping such commitments. This capacity is our gift from the Creator. When we exercise it, we participate in the divine nature. When we abandon it, we reduce ourselves to animal nature governed by impulse and circumstance. Whether you accept the religious framework or not, the observation stands. Self-compulsion is the exercise of humanity's distinctive capacity. It is what makes us human rather than merely clever animals. Animals respond to immediate stimulus. Only humans can choose distant goals and compel themselves toward those goals despite immediate discomfort. This is not a defect requiring correction, but a gift requiring exercise. When you view self-compulsion not as discipline, which sounds punitive, but as sacred practice, which sounds honoring your relationship with it transforms. You are not forcing a resistant self, but honoring your highest self. Each time you act from definite purpose despite resistance, you participate in the divine capacity. Each time you yield to impulse, you reduce yourself to reactive nature. You choose daily which nature you will embody. Acting from purpose despite feeling creates internal alignment. You become integrated rather than fragmented, all parts of yourself oriented toward the same aim. This integration creates peace that accomplishment alone cannot provide. What you develop through self-compulsion, autonomy, self-respect, purposeful action becomes your character. This character is more enduring than any external achievement. It is what you truly become beyond what you merely accumulate. Take time to consider, what has developing self-compulsion revealed to you about human nature and your own nature? How has exercising this capacity changed your understanding of what it means to be human? Write these reflections. They will serve as anchor points when discipline feels burdensome, reminders that you are not engaged in arbitrary struggle but in the fulfillment of human potential. 4 times per year, take 1 hour for deep reflection. How has practicing self-compulsion changed my understanding of myself? What have I learned about human nature through commanding myself into action? In what ways am I more fully human now than before beginning this practice? You see yourself and your daily practice in an entirely new light. The morning discipline that once felt like arbitrary struggle now reveals itself as the exercise of your highest capacity. You are not forcing yourself against your nature. You are aligning yourself with your deepest nature as a being capable of self-governance. This recognition brings dignity to even mundane acts of self-compulsion. Rising at the committed hour is not merely time management, but the affirmation of your autonomy. Working despite resistance is not merely productivity, but the exercise of your unique human gift. You understand, finally, that you are not trying to become something other than yourself. You are becoming more fully what you already are, a being designed for deliberate self-direction. You now possess complete understanding from the recognition of resistance as universal force through the specific techniques of daily practice to the ultimate meaning of self-compulsion as the exercise of humanity's divine capacity. But all understanding is worthless without application. The choice stands before you now. Will you act on what you know, or will you return to the comfortable pattern of waiting for readiness? The answer to that question will determine everything that follows.